everybody, and thank you for tuning into the latest webinar lecture that we've got in our series this year. We're very happy to host Dr. Bridget Conley today, who is going to talk on a topic around starvation. She's giving a presentation titled "What Are Starvation Crimes?" Bridget Conley is Research Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Bridget has published a wide range of really interesting research. She was editor with Alex DeWile and Katrina Murdoch and Wayne Jordash of a book called Accountability for Mass Starvation, Testing the Limits of the Law, which came out last year. And this is the broad area which she'll be talking about today. She's also author of Memory from the Margins, Ethiopia's Red Terror Martyrs Museum, which was published in 2019, and also editor of a volume called How Mass Atrocities End, Studies from Guatemala, Burundi, Indonesia, the Sudan, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Iraq. Today's presentation will go for between 30 and 40 minutes, and after that we will have roughly around 20 minutes for questions. And so we invite everybody to ask any questions or to make any comments that you like, either verbally or in the chat box. But for now, I'll hand over to Bridget.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And as Stephen and I were chatting earlier, it's always lovely to have a chance to reconnect with colleagues and also to get to know some of your community. So to all of you who are joining today, thank you for being with us. So I'm going to talk about what are starvation crimes. And I wanted to start by saying that it emerges from a collaborative project that we, so myself and Alex DeWile at World Peace Foundation, did with lawyers who are at Global Rights Compliance. It's a Hague-based law firm called Accountability for Starvation, Testing the Limits of the Law. And it resulted in an edited volume, which you see the cover of here. So we started working together in 2017, or in the wake of a 2017 announcement from the UN warning that famine had returned. So this project is a little bit about the law. It's a little bit about mass starvation as a tool, a weapon of war. And it's a little bit about changing circumstances in our world today. The warning from the UN in 2017 highlighted conflict and starvation conditions in northeastern Nigeria, in the Boko Haram regions, in Somalia, in South Sudan, and in Yemen. They could have added Syria in areas under siege. And if it was an announcement that would be made today, it would also include the Tigray region of Ethiopia and probably Ukraine. So another reason why we worked on this project now, speculatively, I would say mass killing has become the subject of much greater and intensive attention. There's been more effort to document, to highlight, not saying that the world responds adequately to mass killing, but it is an issue that has become much more visible in our world as an unacceptable component of armed conflict. And so I would pose the question that possibly this makes mass starvation another way of using the civilian population as a tool in war, a more desirable weapon for those who would use it, right? It doesn't get the same level of scrutiny. Another reason is the globalization of food production and distribution and markets. So this has a couple of impacts. One, it means that the disruptions that come with conflict are more intensive in many cases in disrupting food networks, not only for people directly impacted, but also for others who rely on food that might have been produced in that area. Ukraine exports would be a major example of this. But also what we see is even in societies that were more traditionally agricultural, there are transitions, even in South Sudan, right, which is heavily agricultural area, towards wage labor. And so what that means is that the disruptions of war and economic collapse expose people to starvation in different ways. And fourth, UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which was passed in 2018, placed hunger and starvation in the Security Council, right? So it placed it as a political peace and conflict issue. They're supposed to be reporting. It has largely not triggered the kinds of responses that it was promised, or I think some of its advocates had hoped it would do, but it did put this issue squarely, right? The issue of acute, different from chronic, hunger in the context of armed conflict as an issue for international politics. So that's kind of the why now. Some key definitions, right? And I think this is helpful, I hope, background as we get into the discussion. So first, famine. Famine actually does not have a single definition that is adequate to sort of capture the diversity and breadth of situations in which acute food insecurity occurs. There are definitions, right? If you look at 1993, Stephen Devereaux tried to categorize famine definitions, and he proposed there's simple dictionary definitions, right, which focuses on lack of food that causes widespread hunger and death. There are theories of decline in a food availability, right? So trying to theorize why food is no longer there. There are also theories of food consumption deficits. There are behavioral descriptions of responses to widespread hunger. And there are also insider definitions, right? So in a lot of places where there's chronic food insecurity, such that a shock or trigger like armed conflict can produce famine conditions, right? There are all these insider definitions of how people who experience famine describe these times of want. Many of you may be familiar with Amartya Sen, an Indian scholar, who basically said that starvation is fundamentally different from chronic hunger. It implies the virulent and widespread, so that means on scale, right, death, and it's different from normal conditions as a product of deliberate action. So there we start getting closer to the kinds of definitions that we'll look at in mass starvation. But Sen's approach was to look not so much at availability of food as the key point, but the capacity of people to access food, right? There are many cases of famine where food is there in the markets, but people cannot afford it, essentially, right? And so they starve. There's also, if you're coming from a humanitarian background, there's another way of examining famine that was developed by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC. And that's where a lot of the announcements that come through the UN or through official discourse today comes from the designations of famine that they created. It provides both analysis and it's an early warning system. Now it focuses on severity within discrete areas, right? So you'll see IPC 5 is famine, IPC 4, right? This phases of famine. One of the challenges there is that the IPC works with governments to get access and to classify and examine the data that they have. So what this means is that if a government is actively participating in the creation of famine conditions, that there can be a lot of difficulty in coming to an objective understanding of what is going on. It's also localized and looks at degrees of intensity, as I noted. So you could have famine in a very small section of a country, right? It could be a true famine according to their classification, whereas the rest of the country could be at lower levels of acute food shortage or inability of people to access food for a longer time period, leading to potentially even higher levels of death and suffering than might happen in a smaller, more acute area, right? So you could have, like, let's say 1 million people affected by food shortage that doesn't count as famine, but could have theoretically an even higher death or mortality consequences than the smaller area in a more acute situation. So there's lots of ways that people have tried to struggle and try to come up with definitions of famine that would cover diverse areas. None of them really solves all the problems. There's no neat and tidy definition that works perfectly across the board. My colleague, Alex Duvall, has focused on the idea of starvation, right, as the transitive. So famine describes what is happening. The focus on starvation picks up this idea of intention, right, to starve someone else. And that's been the focus of his work under famine crimes, work that he did some time ago, and then under mass starvation as the heading for work that he's done more recently. And that is an intent to starve a people at scale, right? So mass starvation. We also have legal definitions, and that's what this project focused on. So I'll pull these up very quickly. I'm not a lawyer by training, but this will at least give you an idea where this language comes from and its status in the international scene. So starvation as a method of war, and so that's a key point that has to be proven, was addressed in the Geneva Conventions, the Additional Protocols of 1977, and applies in both an international armed conflict and a non-international armed conflict. So here's another key point. Starvation in the law, right? So here we have it prohibited as starvation of civilians. So starvation of combatants, right, as part of siege is legal. As a method of warfare, right? So you have to demonstrate that it's not only starvation sort of as a consequence of war, but actually as a method of warfare is prohibited. And the actions that are prohibited are attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects that are indispensable for life. So this is a key point because it means that food is not the only object, right, or activity, the production of food, that is criminalized. So what else are objects that are indispensable for the survival of civilian populations? Right, so these are some, and this is a non-exhaustive list in the law: foodstuff, agricultural areas, crops, livestock, drinking water, supplies, irrigation works, right? One could be more expansive, arguably, as well, and say that other activities, for instance, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but like nursing children. So there are gendered implications too of the activities that are indispensable for life. In the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, starvation is also criminalized. So that's it's in the Rome Statute. Initially, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, it initially was only criminalized in an international armed conflict. In 2019, that was amended, so starvation is criminalized in both international and non-international conflicts. We proposed this idea of starvation crimes. So Alex and I developed the concept to get not only specifically the crime of starvation, but to also include some of these other criminalized acts that could include the severe and systematic deprivations in a criminalized fashion, right? So in genocide, this language corresponds to creating the conditions of life that would bring about a designated group's destruction. You could get to it through crimes against humanity, and you can get to it through various tenets of human rights law. So it draws on an idea that David Sheffer, who is the former ambassador at large for war crimes in the US, proposed this idea of atrocity crimes, to get around the struggle that people had, especially non-lawyers who are trying to activate the law as a way to show the suffering implications of intentional acts in a conflict, but are not necessarily foremost concerned with prosecutions or a legal framework, but with trying to get to the prohibition part, right, and to spur action. And so he proposed this idea of atrocity crimes. And so in parallel, we wanted to bundle together the bulk of these ideas of the prohibition, whether through the law of starvation, through genocide, crimes against humanity, human rights law, right, to underneath this umbrella term, starvation crimes. So it's not a legal category as such, but it brings together a range of crimes under different provisions of law in a manner that can give them political salience. So in part, what we wanted to do with this is to make starvation visible and nameable for the role that it plays in many conflicts and as an atrocity. So why is this important? For a long time, starvation has been understood as an invisible crime, right? Or a lesser crime, something that does not harm in ways that are as serious as killing, even though often it produces much higher death tolls than direct killing. It's also ubiquitous. If we look across atrocity cases, even just in the post-World War II era, but I'll give you some examples from colonial era as well. Starvation occurs across these cases. I mean, if you go to, and here I have a quote from Primo Levi talking about life in Auschwitz. The camp, he argued, is hunger. We ourselves are hunger, living hunger, right? It's there across these instances, and it has been ignored for the most part in international law. So what are the purposes, right? Across these cases, starvation is not always used as mass killing, right? As that example that we had from Primo Levi. But in many cases it is, right? So if you think of what happened to the Herero in present-day Namibia, right, where Germans forced them into the desert, that was not killing, right, in the sense of massacre, but it was an intentional mass killing. Think of what happened to Armenians pushed into the desert as well. Another use of starvation is to destroy a group's ability to resist, right, to diminish their capacity to maintain resistance. This is classic counterinsurgency. If you think of resettlement camps, that's sort of the signature example that we were thinking of, where people, largely an agricultural people in many of these cases, is resettled into villages where they're torn away from their means of sustaining life, and in a manner that often is completely negligent at best. And when it is sustained over time, you could argue that it implies an intention to destroy the group. Starvation can also be used to seize territory. You'll see the image I have here is from Eastern Ghouta in Syria, right, where the Syrian government's key phrase was surrender or starve, right? So seize territory, you can imagine siege is really the key area in which we're thinking of starvation there. Another way is flushing a population out of hiding. The genocide in Guatemala in the 80s is a good example of this, where people fled military attacks and went out into the mountains where they could escape in military. Similar thing happens in East Timor, but could not sustain the life of people. And so the access to food, right, is then a way to pull them out of a territory. To alter an opponent's political calculus, here think of sanctions. You can think of maintaining right? Strategically maintaining a minimal level of sustenance in order to alter a people's political calculation. Key examples would be the Israeli maintenance of the siege on Gaza, right? And just enough food and supplies are allowed in to sustain life, but to sustain it at a low level that is indeed intended as collective punishment. You could argue that that's what happened under the US sanctions on Saddam Hussein's Iraq as well. Material extraction. So there are benefits to starvation. Some people get rich, others get land. Think of forcing people off a land and on the forced marches of Native Americans, for instance, off of their long-standing cultural and community lands, or Australian Aboriginal people as well, right? Where starvation is used then as a means to push people off of a land. Also, if you think of sieges, wherever there's a siege, there is a very strong economic advantage that is produced for those who can sustain access points. So you get what's called a war economy often, right? But there is material benefit to being able to maintain starvation. To provision combatants, here I think we could also, I should have adjusted this, it's not just combatants, but to provision a favored community, right? A favored portion of the community. So you can starve one population in order to benefit another. When militaries take new land and go with insufficient supplies, but then starve the population as a way to maintain a military campaign. But you can also think of this in terms of colonial privileges for the metropole that then disadvantage local groups. The Bengal, so in India, famine of 1943 under British rule is primary example of this. To coerce labor, you have this across the Gulag, you have this across in some Soviet detention of German POWs and similar cases. A lot of examples of POW starvation where they're used into the forced labor during a conflict. Massive social transformation projects. Right here, obviously, talking about communist revolutions. So you think of Mao, the Great Leap Forward, Khmer Rouge, but also many colonial projects where you transform a society so that their agricultural or other products are designed to be extracted and benefit a different population. So those are some of the uses. Across the board, there's been a failure, though, to prosecute, even the more discrete. So I would say the large-scale social transformations, very unlikely that the law would apply to those. It would be difficult, except possibly. So I include Khmer Rouge as an example. These 4 cases are ones where there has been an international or a national tribunal created to deal with the history of a time period of deliberate destruction of objects indispensable for life, including the distribution of humanitarian aid, but where an emphasis of prosecutors was exclusively or almost exclusively on direct killing. Now, people obviously, if you know, even just, the headlines of these historical events, people died in great numbers of starvation under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, in Ethiopia during the famine that was produced through counterinsurgency in the 80s, the sort of global aid example, and in Darfur in the 2000s. We included Bosnia-Herzegovina. Very few people died of starvation, except in the safe havens that were under acute siege. So think of Srebrenica, for instance, I think is the signature example. But there was widespread manipulation of aid by especially the Bosnian Serbs, who had greater access to controlling the areas. And it was used throughout the conflict. And I think it's an interesting test case of how that was treated as a sort of undesirable, but non-punishable component of the way the war was waged. What's interesting too, in Srebrenica, obviously the focus there was on killing, mass killing, when the town finally fell to Bosnian Serb forces. But the acute siege in the lead up to that act of genocide was not treated as a separate crime in and of itself, even though it was documented by the court in several cases as being a key component of the strategy. Right? Killing was prioritized, not address of the impacts of starvation on civilians. So one of the reasons that it hasn't been prosecuted, hasn't been called out, one, mass starvation, especially if we're looking at conflict related, which is what all contemporary famines are, context matters, right? So it's often starvation occurs in the context of other violent acts, as I noted in the previous examples, right? With widespread killing, with rape, with other forms of violence, torture, and so on, right? Prosecutors and those paying attention to conflicts often draw attention to those dramatic forms of violence. There are also other causes of suffering. So here under this heading, I wanted to get at that most people who die during times of deprivation, severe deprivation, do not die of starvation per se. Right? That's a very distinct lack of food to the severity where that's the actual cause of death. Most of these cases, the cause of death is disease. And so you start getting a little bit of an attenuation between specific acts that a perpetrator commits and cause of death, right? So here you get it through disease being the proximate cause. It's challenging because oftentimes the war, you'll see like the examples I gave, like siege, if you think of Yemen, right, an aerial campaign, the war and the act of violence and the decision-making are carried out at a distance from the suffering experienced, right? So again, we have further sort of attenuation of cause and effect. The other thing is time. When someone is killed, you have an immediate, sort of perpetrator, act, death. In mass starvation, it occurs over the duration, right? It's a way of harming people that is profoundly, causes profound suffering, and it happens over a longer duration. Our argument would be that this actually then can be a part of demonstrating intent. Because there is a long duration, it is almost impossible for those who would inflict this harm to say they did not know or they could not change their actions. So while this could be seen as a way of attenuating guilt or responsibility, it's also another way of saying, like, okay, if you do not want to be seen as responsible when the warning signs are triggered, there is time for them to act. And if they choose not to act, that can be taken then as an implication of intent. One other thing that I wanted to draw our attention to, and then we'll open up for a discussion with you all, is the distinct relationship between sexual and gender-based violence and starvation crimes. On this, I just wanted to make 3 points. One, females tend to experience globally chronic hunger at higher rates than do males. This is due to a large number of factors, but a female disadvantage across economic, cultural, social factors often is a contributing force. In famine, there's a female mortality advantage. Right. So you actually, when chronic hunger here, but when the cliff, when a society hits that cliff and people cannot access food, females tend to survive at higher rates. There are a number of theories. None of them actually bear out exactly or are capable of explaining every case. Some hinge around cause of death. As I noted, most people during famine or mass starvation die from disease. There are a number of diseases that have different gender-related impacts. Respiratory, for instance, often impact males higher than females. And also the coincidence with armed conflict. You will often have men dying sort of in these same zones and complicating how we understand causality of direct violence. There are also physiological factors, body fat, and immune system, but none of the studies that have looked at those, it's not the kind of thing you can study in an abstract scenario and actually see how it plays out, right? That would be ethically unacceptable. Theoretically, what should happen doesn't explain what actually does happen in its entirety. And there have been studies that have tried to take a theoretical approach and contrast it with what we know within a medical unit in a country suffering severe famine, and they don't quite match. So none of these theories really hold across the board. Sexual gender-based violence and starvation crimes are mutually reinforcing atrocity crimes. So let me explain this. There is sexual and gender-based violence can cause starvation crimes. A key example of this is the separation, especially of nursing mothers from infants. As we know, if women are targeted specifically during a conflict, as they often are, and separated from their children forcefully, often for sexual slavery and rape and other forms of violence, that can then cause starvation among a child. The other thing we wanted to emphasize with this, and this is based on work that I did with Diane Mazarana and Kinsey Spears, is that starvation crimes can also produce or be a contributing factor in sexual and gender-based violence. So in this, we are thinking of the search for wild foods, for instance, right? We've heard of many cases in Darfur. This was a theme that many people focused on, of women deciding to go out into the countryside to look for wild foods or firewood so that they could cook foods, and exposing themselves to risk by leaving the safety of a refugee camp or an IDP camp. With the factor being that if men had gone to do that, they would be killed, where women would only be sexually assaulted. There's also sexual exchange practices when food is scarce. There are many documented cases of increased sexual exchange for food. Also increases in child marriage, right, to relieve a household of one more mouth to feed, and forced marriage. So these two forms of violence are, as we note here, mutually reinforcing. The other thing to keep in mind, especially thinking about the female mortality advantage, is there are long-term consequences for survivors of famine, both in terms of their long-term physical health, mental health, and their economic capacity. So if you have women heads of household who survive at higher rates, then you may have then those chronic issues start to become even stronger, right? And for them, the water, if you will, is sort of up to their necks then for the rest of their lives, right? So constantly being at greater risk of living with chronic hunger for them and for their children. These were some of the key things that motivated us to work on accountability for mass starvation, and also some of the findings that we had. And I'm happy to open up the conversation with all of you for anything you'd like to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Bridget. This was very thorough, very interesting, and I'm really I'm really interested in the way that that this project has sifted through existing legalities and existing crimes and illuminated what you've framed as starvation crimes. I think that's that's a really interesting thing to do. And